great pleasure to welcome Andrew Hopkins as our speaker today. I have to read a list of his...
You don't have to.
responsibilities, just to give a gravitas to his presence here. He's a head of research and outreach at the Australian Astronomical Observatory. He manages the astronomy group, mentors researchers and supports career development, expands AAO's research opportunities and initiating projects, coordinated development of data archive infrastructure, managing the student program and the distinguished visitor program, initiating business development activities linking the potential partner industries. On top of that, he's president of Australian Astronomical Society, ASA, whatever that stands for, and trying to do his research in his free time. So what I was really impressed in one of the first Women in Astronomy chapters in 2011, I think, Andrew gave a very good talk that impressed me the most, because whenever there is an issue about women in astronomy or women in science, it's always portrayed as a women issue. And I think what really liked about Andrew's talk is that he showed that it's everyone's issue. So it's a male issue as well. How can male supervisors support female academics? So without any ado, go ahead, give us a...
Thank you very much, Jasmina, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to come and to talk about this. This is not something that I talk about a lot, and mostly what I'm going to be telling you about is information that I've actually learned from coming to things like this and from talking to other people who know a lot more about it than I do. And so I'm here not as somebody who has a huge amount of information or experience or necessarily answers even, but what I am is a messenger. And I hope that the message that I'm able to present to you today and that we can discuss in questions afterwards is one that you're interested in hearing about and one that you're open to hearing about approaches. Please don't shoot the messenger, thank you. So I'm here primarily in my capacity as the ASA president. I will have an AAO hat on later in the talk, and I'll preface that when I get to it. The reason that I'm here in the capacity as ASA president is because the ASA has a chapter called Women in Astronomy, and this chapter has been around for some years. It was implemented back in 2009, and the goals of the chapter are to raise the profile of women in astronomy in Australia. And there are a lot of things that go along with that. Since 2011, the chapter has been organising annual workshops, annual Women in Astronomy workshops, the goal of which is to address the issues of gender balance in the community. Now, I'd like you all to take a quick look around the room and just do a quick mental calculation of the gender balance in this room to give you an idea of the kind of issue that we're thinking about.
And there's a selection bias because of the topic of the talk, so...
Exactly.
That's another point. Actually, I don't have that comment in this particular talk, but that's one that I should, if I don't remember to comment on that at the end, please raise that as a question. Since starting this 4 or 5 years ago, the chapter's mission has begun to broaden. It was very much focused on women in astronomy, and it still very much is. The last couple of Women in Astronomy workshops have actually touched on the broader equity and diversity issues for our community. I'm not going to talk about that in great detail, but do feel free to ask me questions about that if you're interested. And the chapter, of course, has a website. I encourage you to take a look at that. There's lots of information there. It has a lot of links to best practice activities. And when I say best practice activities, I mean things that other institutions are doing to actively promote, retain, and support the women on their staff. So I do encourage you to take a look at those. So what is the problem? Equal opportunity has been enshrined in Australian law for, how many decades is that? 3 at least, maybe 4, I can't count. But there is still clearly a big problem in terms of gender inequity. This is a problem. It can be quantified. If you just count the number of women in especially scientific fields, it's not 50-50. And there are lots of reasons for this, and those reasons can be quite diverse in themselves. But the fact remains that there is still a problem. The problem gets much, much worse as you go higher up the food chain, and it's a well-documented fact, and these statistics have not changed for the last 10, 15 years, that at the most senior levels, not just in academia but in industry, the fraction of women is abysmally small. So, it's not just a question of sitting back and waiting, letting legislation do its thing, letting institutions that have equal opportunity policies propagate, and allowing the young women coming up through the system to fill the numbers up as time goes on. We've had 30 years. We've had 10 postdoc cycles of equal opportunity legislation, and the problem hasn't changed. And some people wonder, okay, well, if things haven't changed, maybe it's actually not really a problem. Maybe this isn't something that we need to worry about at all, in fact. It's a huge problem on many, many levels, because we put a huge amount of effort into training our PhD students, into training our postdocs, establishing them as highly capable, highly competent, high-impact researchers, and then just let half of them or 90% of them wander off into the wilderness. That's probably an oversimplification.
Is it really true this problem hasn't changed?
Sorry?
Is it really true that it hasn't changed?
Change has been slow. I'll show a few plots in a minute. And this last line, in blunt terms, it's a poor economic outcome. If you're going to spend all of that money training people, why would you train them and then let them fall away from the workforce? It's just not good economics. The flip side of that, it turns out, I was reading a story in the Herald just this morning. There was a study done that was released today on ASX 200 companies that looked at the productivity of companies that had at least 25% women on their boards versus those that had none, and compared to everything. Companies with 25% or more women on their boards were 2% more productive, more profit than all ASX 200 companies, but they were 7% more productive than those boards that had 0 women. So the point is, and this is just one study, there have been many, many other studies that demonstrate the same effect, and it's not just in business, it's in academia, it's across the board. The presence of gender diversity provides diverse viewpoints, diverse perspectives. People come with different experiences, they bring different ideas. If you reduce the diversity in your pool of intellect, then you reduce the diversity of the innovation that you can have, and you do worse overall. I've stolen slides, I should have said this at the start, I've stolen slides from a bunch of other people's talks here. Like I said, I'm a messenger as much as anything else. The message is important. So this is, I think I have a couple of slides from talks that Sarah Madison has given over many, many years. This is one that she showed last year. She's shown this on several occasions, but last year at the Women in Astronomy workshop in Canberra in particular. You can see that the statistics are unfortunate. We know that women are being educated and trained and put into positions where they can be successful, and then all of the top positions go to men. And the fraction of executives at the top, at the highest levels, that are women is minuscule. It's less than 10%, in many cases less than 5%. There are issues as well when it comes to applying for research grant funding through the ARC. And I haven't looked at the NH and MRC, but I believe that there are similar statistics there. There are different issues with NH and MRC. I'm not going to talk about that. These two figures, again, this is from a presentation that Sarah Madison put together. This is looking at the period 2004 to 2009 and 2001 to 2009. The top diagram shows the percentage of female in red and male in blue applicants as a function of the age of the applicant. And so you can see that age post-PhD, I believe this is. I don't think the ARC allows 5-year-olds to apply for research grants, but the number of female applicants, the proportion of female applicants is larger at the earlier career stages and dramatically fewer at the late career stages. The success rate for females is given in red and for males is given in blue. In this period, there was a worrying disparity at the early career stage, that women were being proportionately less successful in their grant applications than men. I'll show another figure in a minute to show you where this has evolved. And at the higher career stages, things were evening out, presumably because by the time you get to that level of your career, you're established and equally competent or equally unbiased. Well, I'm not going to go there. There's a lot of reasons why that might be the way it is. For ECRs only, this trend that women applying at the early career stages was systematically having lower success rate than men is an issue. This was identified by the ARC back in 2010, and they have started to work towards addressing that problem. This is a figure from the outcome, the reports that the ARC produces every year, the statistics from the 2015 DP round. Again, this is by age post-PhD of the applicants. Interestingly here, the proportion of women is actually lower at all age levels, but more so at the more senior age levels. There's a big drop between 0 to 5 years and 5 to 10 years, and it just gets worse from there. The success rate at the lower levels has normalised somewhat. It's roughly equal. But interestingly, there's now a disparity at the most senior levels of the applicants.
When you say it has normalised, did the ARC do something actively to fix this?
I think they had an awareness-raising campaign as much as anything else. I don't think that they did anything explicit in terms of mandating success rates for male and female applicants.
But they did introduce the fact that you don't have to give anymore your last 5 years, but your 5 best years?
They did do that, and they have gone to a lot of trouble to emphasise the track record as a function of opportunity. The ROPE, the Research Opportunity Performance Excellence section. And so I think that a lot of awareness raising about these types of things in order... Unconscious bias is another big one. I'm going to be talking about that a little bit too. I'm showing you all of these facts and figures just to start with, to set the scene. The point is that there is still a problem, and it's not going away, at least it's not going away quickly. So let me show you just a couple more slides that have some facts and figures on them. These are rather dense tables of numbers, so I'll try and walk through them. If you look, this is ASA membership demographics as a function of time from 1999 on the right to 2013 on the left, with ASA membership levels from student through associate member, honorary and fellows from the bottom to the top, and the total percentages along the bottom here. So if you pick any particular row and look at what the fraction of women as society members is, you can see that the percentage of the society student membership that is female has oscillated at around the 30 to 40% level over time. And in fact, it's gone through a little bit of a slump in about 2009. It's coming back up a little bit, but not incredibly quickly. So around about a third, maybe a little bit more, of the student body of the ASA membership is women. If you now look at the number of members that we have, so these are active practicing professional astronomers, no longer students, that percentage was about 20% for kind of plus or minus 5% over the last 15 or so years. And again, that number is not changing, or at least it's not changing quickly. And when you get to the most senior level, it's only currently 13% of the membership of the fellows of the society that are female, which is up quite impressively from the 1% that it was 15, 16 years ago, But again, that number is not changing, and it's certainly not representative of the total, and certainly not the student body. If you just take the slow, shallow increase over the last couple of years and allow that to increase continuing in a linear fashion, just assuming that these numbers are going to eventually rectify themselves, it's going to take you 30 years before you get up to 26% of the fellows being women. It's going to take you 60 years to get up to the proportion that we have of students. That's clearly not a satisfactory outcome. We can't just let that natural progression solve the problem for us. It's not working fast enough. We will all be retired. Even the students in the audience will be retired by the time that problem is fixed. And those students, that they will have entire careers where we could have given them a different environment to work in and given them a different outcome. The reason that I'm showing this last demographics slide is because this is a little bit of evidence that suggests that there are active ways to change the outcomes. Back in 2011, when this problem was really highlighted in a very prominent way for the community with that first Women in Astronomy workshop, the Society decided to look more actively at how to address the problem in the bounds that we have some control, our annual scientific meeting. This is our annual scientific meeting. So one of the things that happened was that we recommended very strongly that the organising committees, the scientific organising committees, not just the local organising committees, which, because of the way gender works, the local organising committees tended to be predominantly women, and the scientific organising committees predominantly men, and so we decided to try to rectify that. And so there was a little bit of a dip here with Macquarie last year, but the SOCs being chosen explicitly to be made up of roughly 50-50 men and women is a step in the right direction. Interestingly, that was counterbalanced by a trend in the other direction on the LOCs. I'm not going to comment on that. The other thing that we were trying to identify is to have invited speakers, invited 50-50 men and women. In the year that UNSW ran the meeting, they were going for proportional representation. They had about 30% of the participants were women, and so they had about 30% of the invited speakers as women as well. It's clear that we can do better, and we have been, and that is going to continue. The other thing that it's important to see is that the percentage of actual participants is reflected in the percentage of contributors, so that women are contributing in the regular talks, the contributed talks, in a way which is proportional to their participation in the community more broadly. So I think that the message that I want to get across there is that change is possible, and you can make change quite quickly. This has just happened in a couple of years with a few key recommendations, a few key individuals willing to take on the challenge to make things change. All right, so let me talk about some more of the challenges that are associated with part of the problem. Overt discrimination. This still exists, and every time I hear this, it surprises me. It probably is not as common as it was back in the 1970s or 1980s, but it still exists, and that's really worrying. All employers have legal obligations to deal with this issue. They all have processes in place to manage it. I would encourage everyone to make themselves familiar with the university's policies and procedures around bullying and harassment, because they exist. There are formal processes there, and they are there to support and enhance the environment that you work within. I'm not going to say any more about that, but I will talk about other things. The unconscious bias one is one which has obtained a lot of attention over the last few years. It was raised back in the 2011 Women in Astronomy workshop. It's a recurring theme in all of these discussions. The problem with unconscious bias is that it's unconscious. It's there, it influences the decisions that you make, it influences the choices that you make, but you don't recognise that those decisions and choices are actually biased because it's an unconscious bias. And it's not just about gender, it's about all sorts of things. Anywhere where there is an equity issue, there are unconscious biases. So let me talk a little bit more about that. The Harvard implicit association test. Implicit association is another way of saying unconscious bias. You're unconsciously associating one element with another. Go and have a look at this URL. There are about a dozen different tests. The one that I'm going to focus on today is the science gender implicit association. We all, men and women, have an implicit association between science and men. This is a well-established fact. There have been numerous studies that demonstrate this. There was an analysis done in the US a couple of years ago where they did a mock recruitment and submitted identical resumes to a bunch of selection panels. Their test subjects were selection panels, and the resumes that they were given to review were identical except for the names at the top. One was a recognisably female name, one was a recognisably male name.
Did they submit this to blind to actual selection panels, or were the selection panels aware they were being involved in this experiment?
The selection panels, I think they were aware that it was an experiment.
Someone should prank some real selection panels.
That would also be entertaining. The outcome, I suspect, would be the same. The point that I'm getting to is that both the men and the women on those mock panels ranked the male-named resume higher than the female-named resume, despite the fact that they were otherwise identical. So the point is that unconscious bias is real, it exists, and it influences decisions that we make. The best way of dealing with it is simply by recognising that it exists and considering whether the decisions that you're making, especially on selection panels, but in all other aspects where gender might be an issue, is worth considering. There are a whole bunch of other biases. I don't pretend to be able to give you a complete listing. Any listing is going to be incomplete because it's not my area of expertise. The point is that there are lots of things that you can unintentionally do or say that makes an environment unwelcoming to people who have a different background to you, a different sexual orientation to you, a different religion to you, different political beliefs to you, a whole range of things. Where I'm going with this is to introduce some slides that were presented at the last year's Women in Astronomy workshop by Min Hyun first, who talked about nationality and ethnic background and the impact that that has had on her personally, but in the way that she sees people's interactions more generally. And by Lisa Harvey-Smith, who talked about the issues associated with being a gay person in a scientific research environment. So let me move on to those. The thing that I'm going to emphasise here is that it can be very little things that you do and very small ways that you change your way of thinking about how you interact with people that can have a big impact on the people that you're interacting with. Among an amazing talk that Min gave, which covered her background and where she had come from and her career to date, she raised a couple of things that she identified as being part of the challenges that she had had to deal with. One of the simple things that she said that can be confronting is a question like, where are you from? And she says this is something that you get asked all the time, and it's a perfectly natural question to ask, especially in an astronomy setting where postdocs are from all around the world. It's not uncommon to ask that. But you have to be sometimes a little bit sensitive about how you ask the question, because you don't want to say it in a way that makes that person feel as though you don't feel connected to them because they're different. You need to ask it in a way which is welcoming and supportive. And so Min's point about this is that even such a simple interaction can be quite fraught, and it can be frustrating for the person that you're talking to if they misunderstand your intention. So have a little bit of consideration around questions like that, but also questions like this. Min used the term microinequities, which I think is an absolutely brilliant term. It is just those little everyday things that you might say or do around people that reinforces that they're not like you, or that they're different from you, or you can't respond. There's nothing to respond to. Exactly. And so
integral over time.
It's a really important issue. So the fact is, many of them are unintentional or unconscious. And the reason that Min raised it, and the reason that I'm reiterating it now, is that it's helpful for you to just take a few seconds to think before you say something to somebody, even somebody that you might have been working with for quite a long time, because of what you say or how you say it, that might be construed as a little bit insensitive. And in particular, Min is of Asian background, and in a largely Anglo environment. She grew up in Perth. She had this particular problem. Her name is frequently mispronounced and misspelt. I suspect I still don't say her name correctly, in fact. This is a very common one for people of Asian background in an Anglo-dominant environment. This one is completely and utterly inexcusable. There are many, many occasions as researchers where we see a name on a paper, on an email, on a job application, and because we have a different cultural background to that which that name originates in, we don't recognise the gender. The immediate assumption of most people is that the person is male. Don't make that assumption. If you do not absolutely 100% recognise the gender of the person from the name, do not assume. Okay, so let me move on. These are some comments from Lisa's talk. Lisa talked about the issues about being a gay person in the community. And she talked again in an amazing personal presentation about her history and the challenges that she went through in feeling comfortable to talk about her sexual orientation. These are the kinds of things that contributed to the challenges for her about being able to talk openly about her lifestyle choice. There are obvious ones, and again, these are real concerns that people really have, and they should not be justified. They probably are, but we as a community should not reinforce those fears by continuing to reinforce the social stigma or anything that goes along with that. Lisa talked very much about not having a role model. This is another issue which is broader than just sexual orientation. This is across the board for any group that is a minority or suffers from inequities in one way or another. Having role models, people that you can look up to and say, I could be that person one day, is hugely important. For the men in the audience, we have no lack of role models. There are plenty to look to, going back literally hundreds, in depending on how generous you want to be, even thousands of years. For women in science, there is a much, much smaller pool. That pool exists, but it's much, much smaller, and when you're looking in your immediate environment, your local environment, think of your students. How many women lecturers do they see? Think of your PhD students. How many women supervisors do they have? How many women professors are there in the school or in the university that will be role models for those students, PhD students, postdocs? This is a hard one because these kinds of marginalisations that Lisa talks about are broader community problems. These are not things that we as a society of astronomers can address, not immediately at least, but they are still nonetheless real problems that are important and problematic for gay people in the community. Lisa also gave some really helpful pieces of advice. So these are all things that I'd like you to think about as well. Lisa said that the things that have a big impact on her are things like colleagues who just treat her the same way that they always have, the same way that they treat everyone else. It's not a big deal. You don't go out of your way to mention it or to not mention it. It's just who she is, and people get on with life, and that's hugely important. Someone who is inclusive when you're talking about social events. Someone who points out when people are being insensitive. This can be a really important thing, not just in the context of homophobia, but any kind of insensitive behaviour. Yes, there are bullying and harassment processes, and those things have a very structured, formal process that they go through, and they usually aren't invoked unless the situation is very serious. But coming back to those little micro-inequities, somebody who makes a joke where the punchline is something bad about gay people, that's actually not okay. And it's important, if you're in the presence of people who are doing that, to point out, hey, that's actually not okay. You're being insulting or insensitive. And often, those people may not even realise that that's what they have been doing. Again, I'm using the homophobia as an example here. This is broad, this is across the board, all of the situations where there are inequities. And I'm harping on about it a little bit because one of the easiest things that you can change is simply your awareness of when people are being insensitive to each other. And recognising that it's okay to stand up and say, what you just said is not appropriate. Please apologise, or maybe think about rephrasing it some different way. And as often as not, the person who said that will say, I never even thought about it like that. Oh my God. Sure, of course. I'm sorry, let me say that again. Because most of the time, those little things are just the way you were brought up, when in a time when those types of jokes or attitudes were less challenged, and they propagate. So challenging them is important. Letting people know that what they're doing is not okay is important. And again, these are some examples of things that are a problem and should be challenged. So I mentioned jokes already. Heteronormative assumptions, the assumption that people are the same as you are, that they have the same preferences as you do. And again, this goes beyond sexual orientation across the board. But questions that you might find yourself asking in a social setting, presumably, where you just assume that someone's partner happens to be the opposite gender to them. And so you can change those questions very easily to ones that are making no assumptions. All right, so I've talked a lot about the problems, a lot about the challenges. So let me now throw some ideas out at you. This is a collage that I put together when I gave a summary of the Women in Astronomy workshop last year for the AAO, for the people at the AAO who weren't able to be there. The reason that I'm putting it up here now is to highlight this panel in the middle, right here. Yes, there were lots and lots of women at this event, but there were lots of men as well, and importantly, there were senior men at this event. Change happens top down in this game. I'll talk about that a little bit more, and that's why I wanted to put that up there. Okay, before I get onto that though, I'm going to reiterate some of the things that I've already just said, because I think it bears repetition. And I'm not pretending to give you an entire roadmap of all of the answers that are going to solve all of the problems. That's certainly not anything that I can do. There are a lot of different problems and a lot of different approaches to solving any one of those different problems. So let's start somewhere. One of the things that came up in the 2011 workshop was that some of the solutions are personal, things that you can do for yourself to change the way that you think about things, to change the way that you interact with people. And some of them are institutional, and I'll come on to those again in a minute. So, take-home messages for you as individuals from today. Understand why diversity matters, why it requires everyone's support, including yours, and then maybe think about what you can do to actually get involved and contribute. Recognise that you have unconscious bias. Do one of those IATs. They're actually very quick to do. They're kind of fun and interesting, and you'll learn something about yourself, which might be quite confronting. But that's why it's important that you do it. Consider ethically tricky situations. I haven't gone into any detail here. One of the things that was done at last year's Women in Astronomy workshop was an exercise where Brian Schmidt gave a set of interactive questions based on a set which is on the Astro Better blog. If you haven't looked at Astro Better, go and have a look at it. There's lots of really interesting stuff. It's not just about gender and things that comes into it as a minor component. But there is a list of about 20 or 30 ethically challenging situations, and you're asked to grade on a scale from 1 to 10 how ethical or unethical those situations are. So have a look at those. The one problem with that is that there's no feedback once you've actually submitted your answers. What I encourage you to perhaps do in a group environment is to sit and talk about those the way that we did at the workshop last year, because it's that discussion as much as anything else which is important in exploring the degree to which those situations are ethical or unethical. A lot of them are highly ambiguous, explicitly to draw out those discussions. Continue to educate yourself about the issues. This is a hard one. Most people will go away from the talk today saying, oh, that was really interesting, really important, we should do something about that. And that'll be the end of it. So I'll put up some social media links at the end. If you do nothing else, follow one of those Twitter handles or like that Facebook page and look at it occasionally, because that will help you to start becoming a little bit aware of some of the conversations that happen in this space. I said this one right at the start. Train yourself to look around the room in any gathering and just do a quick mental assessment of the gender ratio. That can be quite confronting. If you go to every single meeting for a month where there is fewer than 10% women, there's a problem. And you need to start recognising that that's not appropriate. And then engage with the community, which you are doing. Right now, this is really important. I'll talk about being a champion in a minute. This last one is really the fundamental issue. If there's anything that you can do as a person, it's be a nice person, okay? Be sensitive to people. Think about how you talk to people. Don't make assumptions. Okay, Male Champions of Change was the title of a talk given by Elizabeth Broderick, again, at the Women in Astronomy workshop last year. She's the Australian Human Rights Sex Discrimination Commissioner, which is, I think, an even longer job title than the one that I have. So that's pretty impressive. And it was also very publicly promoted in the UN's campaign He for She, which Emma Watson launched last year. The very, very clear message that comes out here is that women can't solve this problem by themselves. They have been trying for the last 100 years or more, and yes, there have been some small steps. But if we want to quickly move to an environment where we are changing the gender proportion in senior academic settings and across the board, we have to do more than that. I think the statistic that Elizabeth gave was that if we allow the current rate of change to catch up to gender equality, it will take more than 100 years. So we might actually be a little bit ahead of the curve as far as astronomy goes if it's only going to take us 60 years, all right? But it's not an acceptable solution.
Astronomy, they're practically the same number, right?
Same order of magnitude, indeed. Same number of postdoc life cycles. Okay, successful women in senior roles frequently acknowledge the support of senior male mentors. That's a useful part of the solution. So in an institutional environment, it can be worthwhile if you are a male in a senior role looking at the cohort of women who are coming through the system and inviting them. Don't impose yourself on them, but give them the opportunity to look to you as a mentor. Give them advice. Look out for their career. Encourage them to apply for things. I think I have another slide in a minute where I talk about promoting, in both senses of the word, women by pushing them or encouraging them to apply for jobs, to apply for grants, to apply for promotion, giving them that support in order that they can continue to be successful in their career. And the last point I've said several times, it's worth repeating. It's the boards that are comprised of 90% men. It's the deans and the vice-chancellors that are comprised of 90% men, whatever the statistic happens to be, that have to impose change in order for it to happen. So let me take a slight diversion, and I'll come back to this again, because one of the things that we did in advance of applying for the Pleiades Award, I'll talk about the Pleiades Award again too, at the AAO, was to formalise a diversity committee. We actually had a number of us who were active in this space, but it was clear that the right thing to do was to have a formal committee in place whose goal was to advise the AAO in all matters of diversity, equity, fair representation. So this looks quite like boilerplate, and perhaps in a sense it is, but these are the kinds of things that you should be aiming for. The point of advertising the fact that the AAO has a diversity committee is not to sing our own praises or to kind of say, yay, aren't we great, but to point at, to be able for any institution to point at a body whose role it is to take care of these things, to look out for these things, to encourage change, to encourage suggestions to improve the situation. There's an old saying that goes something along the lines of everybody's problem is nobody's problem. If the list of action items at the end of the meeting says action brackets all, then nobody's going to do it because everybody thinks it's somebody else's job. So if you have a committee who is explicitly tasked to deal with this, then there are people who are accountable. There is a collection of people that people can talk to. People know if there's a problem, okay, let's go talk to the people on this committee. Now, all institutions already have processes in place. If there is bullying and harassment going on, there is an institutional representative who is identified that you can go and talk to and start formal proceedings or whatever it might be. But we're talking about things that are broader than just that. Those things are important too, and the diversity committee needs to link to those formal processes. And the reason that I've highlighted or bold-faced a couple of names here are twofold. One is to point out that the diversity committee isn't just made up of a bunch of students or postdocs. It has senior AAO staff members. Neville Legg is our general manager, second in charge to Warwick Couch, the director, and myself as head of the astronomy group. And Rajni Prasad is our personnel officer. She's the head of the HR for the AAO. And she's the formal point of contact if any formal proceedings need to start happening. Having those people on the committee is important because it raises awareness at senior levels of what the issues are, and it gives people at senior levels the tools that they can then look at to start implementing change. How am I going for time, Jasmina? I want to make sure I leave some time for questions at the end too. So let me move on. So, coming back to solutions, a diversity committee can be a very important tool because there is a collection of people who can be responsible and responsive in addressing the problem. This is one of the things that we've just in the last little while, last year or two, well actually some of the groups have been doing it for a bit longer, including astronomy, tracking the proportions of applicants for recruitments by gender. So not just in shortlists, but the applicants. Because you're not going to get a shortlist which has some kind of proportional female representation if the applicants don't. And don't just track it and put it in a spreadsheet that lives in a desk somewhere or in somebody's computer. Get the diversity committee to keep track of it. I'm saying this because it's one of the things that's been on my mind in the AAO context quite a lot, especially in the engineering side of the AAO. We routinely have applicant pools which are 100% male. Engineering, especially very specialised engineering, has an even worse gender diversity problem than astronomy or physics more generally. Solving that problem is really, really hard, but one of the ways that you can do it is this. I found it incredibly... Let me take a step back. Before I moved to the AAO, I was invited to apply for a senior position at the CSIRO by Brian Boyle, who was then the chief of what was then still ATNF. And my response to him was, I'm not sure that I could do that. That's quite a senior management level position. I don't really think that I'm ready for that. Can I have a chat with you? And I had quite a long conversation with Brian over the phone. It was about an hour or so, which was a huge amount of time for a director to give some potential applicant for a job. But what he said to me was remarkably encouraging and actually motivated me to apply for that position. And I got an interview, which was fantastic. Didn't get the job, and that was fine. But when the position at the AAO that I currently have came up, I was ready to apply for that job because I knew that I was competitive. Just that simple act of talking to somebody, especially if it's coming from a senior person in the field, if it's coming from the person who's running the recruitment process, going out and talking to potential women applicants, some of them will apply. That is hugely, hugely important. So I really strongly recommend doing that. It goes beyond just appointments. You've been reading this faster than I've been talking about it. Encourage women to apply for awards at all levels. Encourage them to apply for recognition in whatever way is appropriate. Encourage them to apply for promotion within the university system, and nominate them for recognition. Keep an eye out for what types of awards there are out there. The ones that you thought about applying for when you were doing your postdocs but never got around to or failed in being successful at, or maybe you were successful at it, find a woman and encourage her or nominate her to do the same thing. The more women who are in the pool, the bigger the success rate will be. And as an institution, apply for the ASA Pleiades Awards. The Physics and Astronomy group here will be eligible, as it was last year, to apply. Identify, have a look at the Women in Astronomy website with the information about the Pleiades Awards. Identify what you need to do to be successful in that process and do it. That, as much as anything else, is an excellent way to start addressing things at an institutional level. All right, I'm going to finish with this summary slide. The top bullet point is to remind me to tell you that what I have been saying is a tiny, tiny drop in the ocean. There is no way that in one colloquium I can cover all of the issues and give you all of the answers. Making yourself aware of some of the issues, looking at this as part of your everyday life, looking around you to see what the fraction of women in the room happens to be, is an important step. Have a look at some of the links on the Women in Astronomy website. There are links to other institutions who are doing great things in terms of opportunities that encourage and support women in the workplace. The social media sphere is a great place to have a look for where the conversation is at the moment. There will be many, many links to follow. You can spend entire days reading through material that will horrify you and shock you and leave you feeling very, very disturbed, but some things which will also make you feel warm and fuzzy inside. Those are both important. And I think the last bullet point is thanks to the Women in Astronomy chapter, because I said right at the beginning, just a messenger here. All of the things that have happened at the AAO, all of the things that have started to change in our community have been as a consequence of activities of a few individuals within the chapter, supported by the chapter broadly, and this is a really, really crucial point, supported by key senior male department and group heads around the country. You don't necessarily have to magically just come up with solutions. If someone comes up to you and says, hey, I think this would be a great thing to do, say yes. That sounds fantastic, let's make it happen. Maybe it's going to cost a few dollars, maybe it's going to cost a lot of dollars, and then you have to get a lot more people on board. But think about it. Don't just say no. I'll stop there. Thank you.